Hi everyone, and welcome to the next video on lessons from Capablanca. This time we're going to look at both principles of the opening and the importance of central control. Writing about general strategy of the opening, Capablanca said, "The main thing is to develop the pieces quickly, get them into play as fast as you can." He goes on to say that from the outset, two moves, e4 or d4, open up lines for the queen and a bishop. Therefore, theoretically, one of these moves must be the best, as no other first move accomplishes so much. He then gives the sample opening e4, e5, and knight f3, which he says is good because it combines development with attack, and pawn at e5 here. Now knight c6, which is also good because it combines development with the need to defend to pawn on e5. So knight c3 and knight f6, which he says are moves made purely with development in mind. And now bishop b5, about which Capablanca says, "It is generally advisable not to bring this bishop out until one knight is out, preferably the king's knight. The bishop could also have been played to c4, but it is generally advisable, whenever possible, to combine development and attack, the threat here being on the pawn at a5, because bishop takes c6 followed by knight takes e5 is threatened." So bishop b4, and black replies in the same manner, threatening a possible exchange of bishop for knight, as we saw before with white playing it, and then knight takes e4 to follow. So white castles, which Capablanca writes is an indirect way of preventing bishop takes c3, which more experience or study will show to be bad. At the same time, the rook is brought to the center, a very important point. So now black castles and follows the same line of reasoning. Then comes d3 and d6, and these moves have a twofold object: to protect the king's pawns and to open a diagonal for the development of the queen's bishops. So bishop g5, and Capablanca writes, "A very powerful move, which brings us to the middle game stage, as there is already in view a combination to win quickly by playing knight d5. This threat makes it impossible for black to continue playing symmetrically. There is a long line of analysis that shows black should lose if he plays bishop g4. So he is now forced to play bishop takes c3. And then comes b takes c3. And this brings three things to our attention. First, the complete development of the opening has taken only 7 moves. This varies up to 10 or 12 moves in some very exceptional cases. As a rule, 8 should be enough. Second, black has been compelled to exchange a bishop for a knight, but as compensation he has isolated white's a-pawn here and doubled the pawns on the c-file. Although at such an early stage of the game this is rather an advantage for white, as the pawn is doubled towards the center of the board. Third, white, by the exchange, brings up a pawn to control the d4 square, and puts black on the defensive, as experience will show, and thus keeps the initiative. An unquestionable advantage. There'll be more about the initiative later in the series. Capablanca goes on to say that the strategical principles expounded above are the same for all the openings, only their tactical application varies according to the circumstances. Before proceeding any further, I wish to lay stress on the following point which the student should bear in mind. Before development has been completed, no piece should be moved more than once, unless it is essential in order to obtain either material advantage or to secure freedom of action. The beginner would do well to remember this, as well as what has already been said about bringing out knights before bringing out bishops. Which brings us on to the second section of this video, which is about control of the center. And about this, Capablanca writes, the 4 squares d4, e4, d5, and e5 are the center squares, and control of these squares is called control of the center. The control of the center is of vital importance. No violent attack can succeed without controlling at least 2 of these squares, and possibly 3. Many a maneuver in the opening has for its sole objective the control of the center, which invariably ensures the initiative. It is well always to bear this in mind, since it will often be the reason for a series of moves which could not otherwise be properly understood. He then goes on to say that he'll take an opening at random and explain it according to those principles, giving the following example: e4, e5, knight f3, and d6, as opposed to knight c6, which we saw in the last example. And Capablanca says, a timid move. Black assumes a defensive attitude at once. On principle, the move is wrong. In the openings, whenever possible, pieces should be moved in preference to pawns. So d4, and white takes the offensive immediately and strives to control the center so as to have ample room to deploy his forces. Knight d7. Black doesn't wish to relinquish the center and also prefers the text move to knight c6, which would be the more natural square for the knight, but on principle the move is wrong because it blocks the action of the queen's bishop, and instead of facilitating the action of black's pieces, tends, on the other hand, to cramp them. Bishop c4 and bishop h6. Black is forced to pay the penalty of his previous move. Such a move on black's part condemns by itself any form of opening that makes it necessary. White threatened knight g5, and black couldn't stop it with bishop e7 instead of h6. Let's have a look. If bishop e7, now d takes e5 will win a pawn after knight takes e5. If instead d takes e5, then queen d5 is winning for white. So knight takes d5, knight takes e5, sorry, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, d takes e5, queen h5. And white will win a pawn, and his position will be fine. So h6 is forced. Now knight c3, knight gf6, bishop e3, bishop e7, queen e2. It should be noted that white doesn't castle yet. The reason is that he wants to deploy his forces first, and through the last move force black to play c6 to make room for his queen, as white threatens rook d1 to be followed by d takes e5. Black's other alternatives would finally force him to play e takes d4, thus abandoning the center to white. So c6, rook d1, queen c7, and white castles. And with this last move, white completes his development, while black is evidently somewhat hampered. A simple examination will suffice to show that white's position is unassailable. There are no weak spots in his armor, and his pieces are ready for any maneuver that he may wish to carry out, in order to begin the attack on the enemy's position. The student should carefully study this example. It will show him that it's sometimes convenient to delay castling. Capablanca now moves on to the next example of this section, which goes as follows: e4, e5, knight f3, d6, d4, and bishop g4. So a variation slightly different from the last one we saw. And Capablanca says, a bad move which violates one of the principles set down, according to which at least one knight should be developed before the bishops are brought out, and also because it exchanges a bishop for a knight, which in the opening is generally bad unless there is some compensation. So d takes e5 and bishop takes f3, because playing instead d takes e5 loses a pawn to queen takes d8, king takes d8, and knight takes e5. So bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, d takes e5, and bishop c4. So queen f6 to defend f7. Again, because playing instead knight f6 loses at least a pawn to queen b3. So queen f6, now queen b3 anyway, b6 because that pawn was threatened, knight c3 and c6 in order to prevent the strong knight d5 from white. Black, however, has no pieces out except for his queen, and white, with a bishop and a knight already developed, has a chance of quickly obtaining an advantage by playing knight d5 anyway. The student is left to work out the many variations arising from this position. Let's have a quick look. If knight d5, c takes d5, and bishop b5 check, and Fritz is saying white definitely has an advantage after knight c6, e takes d5, knight g e7, d takes c6 castles, and queen a4. It's at plus 1.59. So that's one example anyway, but there's obviously many possibilities there. And at the end of this section, Capablanca finishes by saying, these examples will show practical application of the principles previously enunciated. The student is warned against playing pawns instead of pieces at the beginning of the game, especially h3, h6, and a3 or a6, which are moves very commonly indulged in by beginners. So, that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Please leave any comments or thoughts. Thanks very much.